Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. Tonight we're talking about democracy. Joe Biden's hosting a two-day summit on this issue. Let's hear from Mr. Biden speaking earlier at the White House.
Will we allow the backward slide of rights and democracy to continue unchecked? Or will we, together, have a vision and the vision, not just a vision, the vision and courage to once more lead the march of human progress and human freedom forward? I believe we can do that, and we will, if we have faith in ourselves and in our democracies and in each other. And today, I'm proud to launch the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal, which will focus efforts across our diplomacy and foreign assistance programs to bolster democratic resilience and human rights and globally.
I hope that's not a serious cough he's got there, Joe Biden. So this Summit for Democracy will be joined by a video call delegates from the world over, except for Russia and China. These two uninvited states have played down the whole importance of this event. In Beijing, they're calling it a joke and a sign of sinister imperialism. In Moscow, they're accusing Biden of new Cold War mentality. I'm just left thinking, wasn't it just like earlier in the week that the Biden-Putin phone call on Ukraine was described as frank and professional by the Kremlin themselves? Anyway, there you go. Our guests for this debate here in the studio, Jean-François Demelio, president of the Asia Center think tank. Jean-François, thanks for being with us. Joining us by Skype from New York, we have Sherry Berman, who's professor of political science at Barnard College. Sherry, if you can see me, we can see you. Thanks for joining us. Be with you in a moment. Back here in the studio, Clément Perrault, who is the organizing trainer at the Popular Primary. Clément, thanks for being with us. Great to see you. And joining us by Skype from Washington, we've got Michael Abramovitz, who's president of Freedom House. Michael, thank you very much indeed. Can I start with, I'll throw the question out here, and then we'll see who replies first, I suppose. Is this really the USA trying to sort of push its view of democracy on the rest of the world? Sherry, can I ask you, get you to tackle that one first? Who's the US to tell anybody how to handle democracy?
A reasonable question given the rather decaying state of democracy in the United States today. And that has surely been pointed out by several of the opponents of the summit, including Russia and China, which you just mentioned. But democracy is a universal value. It's not something that is indigenous to the United States or distinctive to the West. And so the idea of trying to promote it, to strengthen it, to come up with an agenda to renew it, that should be something that is not United States specific. But surely the fact that it is coming from the United States, a country with many democratic problems, will enable those outside the sphere of democracies to push it aside more easily than it should be.
Sherry, thank you. Michael Abramovitz, I'm testing the line, of course, to check that we've got communications within Washington. Michael, thinking back to last January, obviously the whole idea of democracy in the US was really called into question, wasn't it?
Well, certainly on January 6th, there was an effort to disrupt the election. So certainly in America, we've had our own share of challenges. But I do agree with Professor Berman that democracy is not a U.S. construct. It's a global issue. And I would just say that my sense is that the Biden administration has not approached this in a particularly arrogant way. They have fully acknowledged the deficiencies in democracy here in the United States, and they've said we all need to do better. So it strikes me that that's a reasonable approach for the administration to take.
So the actual concept, Michael, of what's going on is a good one. How about the guest list?
If I were drawing up the guest list, I would certainly not have included everyone the administration did. You know, we at Freedom House, we do an annual survey of democracies, as you know, and there are a number of countries in there that are, don't do well according to our surveys. But I think most of the countries that are there are democracies, and I do think that the administration has has geopolitical realities to consider. You can't have India and not have Pakistan. At least that's the way they see it. So I think that they made what I think are political, rational choices. But I think the point is that the countries that come to the summit need to be pressed to improve their own their own democracies. And I expect we will hope to see that happen over the next year or so.
Echoing Biden's words back in February this year, democracy doesn't happen by accident. We have to defend it, fight for it, strengthen it, and renew it. Let's bring in Clément Perrault, the organising trainer at the Popular Primary. Clément, you've written a number of books regarding democracy and particularly with an angle on the USA. What are your thoughts about this idea of this summit for democracy?
There is something strange in the fact that a president of such a sick democracy pretends to be able to be the hero of it in global scene. I think that if Joe Biden wants to be heard and trusted on his sincerity on that, he should first maybe make the voting day a holiday in the US, then get rid of Citizen United to get the big money out of politics and make a huge improvement in the way the media cover politics in the US. These are three bottom lines which are just non-negotiable to then pretend to be a living democracy. There is something strange in this list that say you are or you are not a democracy, while democracy is a work in progress. And it seems that in this work in progress, the US is on stop. It has been many years.
I need to bring someone back in from the US before I bring you in, Jean-Francois, to get a comment on that one. Sherry, did you hear what Clément was saying there about the things that perhaps should be changed? Would you agree with what he was saying there? For instance, making the voting day a holiday.
Those and more are good suggestions. It's not that Biden doesn't favor those things. He does. The problem is that there are blockages to him doing those things, most notably a Republican Party that has turned significantly away from democracy. So I agree with my colleague that there are significant problems in American democracy, that the reforms that he mentioned and others would be a beginning of a way to address them. But Biden is blocked in his ability to do so. I agree also with my colleague from Freedom House that I think one thing that makes this democracy summit somewhat more palatable is Biden's explicit recognition that the United States also faces problems with its own democracy. And so it comes at this summit not as the avatar of liberal democracy, not as the purported representative of a perfect democracy, but rather as one recognizing its problems and wanting to help spearhead a charge to come up with some solutions for those kinds of problems.
Sherry, thank you very much indeed. And please bear with us. We'll bring you back in as soon as we can. Same for you as well, Michael, in Washington. Clearly, there are issues regarding Donald Trump and his claims, which we can go into ad nauseum, as much as you want, no problem at all. Let's bring in Jean-Francois Demelio, who is from the Asia Center think tank. Jean-Francois, China not invited to this event. I know that's not your only reflection on this topic, but can I start by asking you about your thoughts on that? China not being invited, is that right? Is that wrong?
Well, I think on many topics, the more you invite China, the better it is. Why is it so? Because you have to see the real face of China. And I think on a topic like democracy, it would have been very interesting to confront the definition by Chinese leaders of what they think about democracy. And it's clashing so much with our idea that it would have been glaring why this country is going so far apart from our world. You know, of course, we are all talking about democracy just as if there were just one definition, but we did not define what is democracy. I think it's very good that someone, somewhere, takes the initiative of inviting people to talk about democracy. Now, what will be the process of this meeting? Is it a process where people strive at redefining democracy, or is it just a small talk about that's fine, we are all democracies the old way, and let's talk together? I think there is a real need in this world to redefine democracy in our Western world and also while talking to other parts of the world. Because, no, it's a very wide world which encompasses lots of things, and you have now, in Asia especially, new forms of democracies, direct democracies, which are extremely interesting and which are not really well known in Europe. And I think it's a very good opportunity, for example, that Taiwan is invited.
And what's something that Beijing, of course, would have found very insulting, that Taiwan's invited and they're not?
Well, it would have been very interesting, to have Beijing on the one hand and Taiwan on the other hand, because that would be, for Biden, a superb opportunity to be kind of broker on what we call track 1.5, where you have officials and non-officials talking together. I did that in Asia. It happened to me to organize talks between mainlanders and Taiwan officials or non-officials. And they spoke about different topics. And, you really extract value out of this dialogue.
That must have been fascinating, Jean-Francois. Thank you very much indeed. Can I bring you in, Michael Abramovitz, on the back of what Jean-Francois was just saying there, but also sort of just basically put it to you that, we're having a boycott, diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympic Games, which the US is leading. Would it not been, say, perhaps better from the US perspective to, say, invited China to discuss the idea of democracy rather than going on with this boycott, this kind of half boycott of the Winter Olympics, which Emmanuel Macron's described as basically, I'm looking at the word in front of me, insignificant. That's what Macron says.
Well, I think you're talking about two different things here. I mean, the Olympic Games are a games. It's a political event, I suppose, in a certain respect. But I think the International Olympic Committee made a very serious mistake putting the Olympics in Beijing. And I think that the United States and other countries are making, I think, reasonable decisions that we're not going to penalize the athletes, but we're not going to legitimize what is a propaganda effort by the Chinese government. I think on the question of whether or not to invite China to the Democracy Summit, I think it would have been ludicrous to have China at the Democracy Summit. I'm all for having engagement with China about many different issues, global warming, economic issues. We all recognize that there's a need to engage China, and even during the Cold War, we had engagement with the Soviet Union between the West and the East. But I do think that the conception of democracy is so far apart. The Chinese Communist Party insists on a monopoly of power. They don't allow freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion. I think there's really no common grounds there. And I think the United States made a legitimate decision not to invite countries that have really absolutely no interest in what is widely understood to be common understandings of what democracy is.
Michael Abramovitz, president of Freedom House, thank you for doing my job for me, because I'm about to introduce a report on those very issues that you've just outlined.
Reporters Without Borders is sounding the alarm over China's crackdown on press freedoms. According to its latest investigation, Beijing is waging an unprecedented campaign of repression against journalism. In the report released on Tuesday, the NGO said 127 Chinese journalists are currently in prison, 71 of them members of the Uyghur community, a Muslim minority that the Chinese government accuses of terrorist activity. Since 2019, to obtain or renew press accreditation, journalists must download a Communist Party loyalty app. Once downloaded, the software remains on the phone and allows personal data to be collected or modified without the journalist's knowledge. It can also trigger the phone's recording devices, which can then be used to spy on the reporter and their sources. Chinese journalists are well aware that mentioning Tibet or Taiwan are subject to censorship. But according to RSF, the number of taboo topics keeps rising and now include pandemic reporting, natural disasters, and the Me Too movement. Those who break the rules find themselves accused of espionage or subversion, like several journalists covering the virus quarantine in Wuhan. Zhang Zhan was sentenced to 4 years in prison for picking quarrels and provoking trouble, a motive often used as justification for arresting political dissidents. And China's media crackdown goes beyond its own citizens. Last year, 18 foreign reporters were forced to leave the country.
Let's reintroduce our guests to talk about the issue of democracy. We've got Jean-François D'Amelio here in the studio, president of the Asia Center think tank. By Skype from New York, Sherry Berman, professor of political science at Barnard College. Here in the studio again, Clément Perrault from the Popular Primary, and joining us by Skype from Washington, Michael Abramovitz, president of Freedom House. What we heard there, I think, for everybody is disturbing. As a journalist, the idea of having yourself checked up on by any government is certainly a scary thing. I can reveal that certainly I've had sort of things that have made me think I've been checked up on by a certain government. Obviously, we've had the story about Pegasus spyware being used by various governments to check on various parts of society, including journalists. China, not alone in its abuses of democracy in this way. Michael, can I bring you back in on that?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what your question is, but first of all, I'm a former journalist, so I, worked in journalism for almost 25 years before I moved over to the nonprofit world, and the situation in the United States is so different from China and other countries. Journalists here are not being thrown in jail. They're not being censored. There are problems here. But China is very seriously a bad place to be an independent journalist. One of the figures I'm quite struck by at Freedom House is that every year we assign a country, including the United States. We don't shy away from the United States, but we assign each country a score on a scale of 0 to 100. 10 years ago, China was at a score of 17 on a scale of 100 in terms of political rights and civil liberties, which include press freedom. And that's a pretty low score in a global scale, but China had been a little bit opening up in up until then. But under President Xi, China's gone in a decidedly much more repressive direction. And so the score now is 10 on the global scale of 0 to 100. So we have deep concerns about freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of thought inside China. And I think that's something that's recognized not just by U.S. groups, but by groups all over the world.
Michael, thank you. Jean-François, can I bring you in on that? I know you're not here to defend China, but do you have a perspective on what Michael was saying?
Well, I think once again, it's all a question of defining democracy, and I'm not supporting Chinese definition of democracy, but we tend to focus the definition of democracy on a very, very few items. For example, freedom of press, which indeed is a component of democracy. But I think at the core of the definition, we should look at the election system before anything else. And I think we did not talk at all so far about is democracy closely linked to the election system, and should we talk about that? I think the first topic that Biden should open is our system representative enough? Is it representing the people's opinion? And which system is now able to present best people's opinion in a digital era, in an era where people are more and more educated? This is all about this. And I think this has not yet been debated.
Sherry, I'm sorry, Clément, go ahead.
Sherry said previously that Biden is not able to do what he wants because he's blocked. No, he accepts to be blocked by a handful of senators, among them Manchin and Sinema, who block measures aligned with their big funders, measures who actually are massively supported by the public opinion. And the fact that the democracy in the US is unable to pass laws that are highly popular in the popular opinion is an issue. And is an issue because it looks as if the establishment Democrat has given up on the fact to really make a lively democracy in the US. And it started in 2008 when Barack Obama, after an amazing campaign with an amazing organizing movement, decided to dismantle this popular vote force and this organizing force who could have put pressure on the government, on the Senate, on the Congress to pass laws that were not passed because he decided to try to bargain, try to negotiate with the Republicans. It was a fail. And actually, since Joe Biden was not elected on any organizing support, large popular support, self-organized, that's normal that he cannot deliver things. But what we can see on the left-hand side of the political chess inside the Democratic Party is that it's moving, that the citizens are not giving up, and that they are winning, actually, elections in the recent months.
Sherry Berman, can I bring you in to comment on what we've just heard, please?
So there has been a lot of puzzling things said by my colleagues that I just simply do not understand, and I will go.
Go ahead.
I will go in reverse order. Biden, the way the American political system works, Biden cannot force senators to do anything. He can try to convince them that they are making poor decisions. He can try to provide incentives and disincentives for them to change those decisions, but he is not in a position to force them to do anything. That is the way the American political system works. It is perfectly democratic. We may not like it. It may block policies that we prefer, but there is really nothing anti-democratic or suspicious about that. As far as this idea that Obama dismantled popular movements or pressures that could have changed the system in some fundamental way, perhaps for some nefarious purposes or because he believed stupidly that he could bring Republicans along. I don't really know exactly what my colleague is talking about. There certainly were mistakes that Obama made, and perhaps one could argue that he was too sanguine about the ability to bring Republicans along. But again, this is part of the democratic process. The impression that I got from my colleagues was that when voters vote for something that is objectively, perhaps, or rather, I would say, in our view, problematic, that we should somehow dump democracy. Democracy is not about always getting the right decisions. Democracy is not about outcomes. Democracy is about processes. It's about allowing people to have their voice. Now, there are lots of structural and institutional problems in the American democratic system. I'm a scholar of democracy. I'm very aware of those. But, if you don't like what politicians do and what voters prefer, well, then maybe you don't like democracy, which brings me to the questions raised by my colleague about China. There is simply no definition of democracy that makes any sense whatsoever that China's political system could be incorporated under. And insofar as elections are concerned, our elections in the United States are very flawed. There is no doubt about that. But there is simply no definition of democracy, electoral or otherwise, under which China's system could fall without totally watering down the definition of democracy to the point where it's meaningless. Frankly, I think the very fact that China tries so hard to pretend that there are democratic aspects of its system is a reflection of the fact that it knows that it does not have popular legitimacy. Its legitimacy is based entirely on performance at this point. And if it does not seem to be doing better than democracies, its legitimacy will diminish accordingly because it does not rest on the will of the people, on the participation of the people, on the recognition of citizen rights. So let's recognize that what China has, you may want to argue for it, but you cannot argue for it under the category of it being somehow more or better or differently democratic.
Indeed. Sherry, thank you very much indeed for brushing away a number of those issues, and we'll give our panelists the chance to reply to that, starting off with Jean-François D'Amelio.
I think the four of us, or the five of us, if I include you, we have something in common, that we always lived in democracies. And I think the front runners, the guests who should be in the first row at this summit should be people who fought for democracy. Democracy possibly cannot be defined, but at least you know what is democracy when you don't have it. And democracy, before anything else, is a fight. And even for us, it has to be a fight every day. So I don't think that we should take democracy for granted and for something, which is absolute value, except if we talk to people who know really what it is because they fought for it.
Indeed. I saw a quotation in the New York Times earlier from the Polish-born political scientist Adam Prozorski. Democracy is, quote, a regime in which incumbents lose elections and leave office if they do. And I think that's probably a very important distinction, Clément, that, if one part of an election doesn't respect democracy, then it just undermines the whole thing.
My point was not to say that
Sorry, go ahead.
that the US are as weak in terms of democracy as China. No one would say that, and I would be stupid to pretend. My point is to say when two senators are blocking a decision which would be good for the country and which is supported by a massive majority of the opinion, it shows that there is an issue in the voting system. And actually, it's something which is very strange to never question that much. How come when there is more than two people who run for office, we just have one name to pick? The one name to pick system is maybe the stupidest thing we can imagine to express the opinion of an electoral group. And actually, at the popular primary, during primary we organized this January to decide who we are going to support for the presidential election, we use a better system, which is named a majority judgment vote, where each and every citizen can give a mention from excellent to be rejected to each and every candidate. And then you have a real...
So this is a more proportional idea of selection you're talking about?
It's a more precise way to express the opinion, because you express your opinion on each and every candidate. And then the one who wins is the one who has the best majoritarian mention. This is a little bit more complex to explain, but we must never give up democracy on this fact of simpleness.
Okay, Clement, thank you very much indeed. Sherry, I hope you're happy to move on, because I think you had your say and expressed clearly what you thought, and I think you both agree that there are things that need to be changed. Can I just ask all of you about we've spoken about China, obviously Russia not invited, probably for similar reasons. How about a country like Turkey, a NATO member? There are questions about President Erdogan and his re-election, and whether it was fair, whether it was just. And how he actually governs. That's the other issue as well. Is it right that Turkey shouldn't be brought around the table? Michael, can I put that to you?
I think it's reasonable that Turkey was not invited. It's clear that Mr. Erdogan, really is an autocratic leader. He's imprisoned, I believe, more journalists in Turkey in the last 5 years than any other country in the world. I don't have our scores in front of us, but Turkey's done very poorly in Freedom House scores over the last 10 years. I think it's been one of the poorest performers in terms of all the countries that we analyzed. So I think it was a reasonable decision not to invite Turkey to the summit.
Sherry, can I have your thoughts? Turkey as a NATO member, Sherry, does NATO have a place at the summit?
Well, NATO is an alliance for security purposes, and so I don't think it necessarily has to completely overlap with the Democracy Summit. I mean, the problematic aspect of not inviting Turkey is not with regards to its political system, which by all accounts, including those assessments done by Freedom House, is not a democratic system anymore. It is much more of an electoral autocracy. However, there are other countries that were invited that have political systems very similar to Turkey's. India, which was already mentioned, Brazil is probably close. And so the problem is that if you invite some countries whose democratic bona fides are really quite questionable and not others, then what you are doing is bringing up, as my colleagues have pointed out earlier, the stark reality that in addition to this being a democracy summit, quote unquote, it is also a summit that is designed to address certain geopolitical concerns, namely threats from China and Russia, and that required a weakening of the definitions for some countries, but not others, like Turkey.
So, Sherry, just to sort of stay with you, if you don't mind, certain people have criticised this event as being more geared towards free movement of trade rather than actually democracy. Would you say that's a fair criticism?
No, I mean, or rather, I would say that the fairer criticism, or rather the more accurate criticism, is that the Democracy Summit, in addition to being a democracy summit, is also a summit designed to deal with geopolitical challenges, and those two things do not directly coincide. And so dealing with the challenge of China and Russia means making nice with countries whose democratic bona fides are not sterling. India, Poland, that kind of thing. And so, we have realpolitik considerations conflicting to some degree with more idealistic ones, that is to say, to promote, protect, and strengthen democracy. So I think that, that tension, if not contradiction, is definitely something that, is worthy of some criticism, or at least pointing out. That seems to me the larger problem, rather than one that's focused primarily on economic gains or trade gains or something of that nature.
Looking at the map as you're speaking, Sherry, we're seeing Europe has the most number of guests invited in. I'm not quite sure what to make of the way this spread goes across the world. Jean-Francois, can I bring you in to get a thought on that? We were talking about India, obviously, about Narendra Modi, about his harsh nationalist approach, basically pro-Hindu, and everyone else can try and see what they can get out of it as well. And clearly bringing someone like that to the table to talk about democracy perhaps seems, maybe they're trying to convince him to change.
Once again, I think it all depends what this summit is about. If it's just to grant good marks and bad marks to people, I think you don't need a summit. I think Freedom House is there to tell us which regime leaves more space to journalists, for example. This is not the point in having a summit about democracy. I think the point is, how can we improve altogether the move towards democracy? If that's the agenda, that's fine. But if the agenda is just to say, you're here because you are a democracy, well, you can have a 5-minute summit and just everyone goes back home. Mm-hmm. I think the agenda should be, one, how can we improve the democratic process in every country which participates? And two, should we have a democratic order of the world? Because I think one of the issues, if you are the first GDP in the world, like the US are, it's not about, am I legitimate to have a summit about democracy, but because I take the initiative and I have a certain posture in the world, possibly I can also ask my counterparts, how can we have a more democratic order of the world? I don't see that on the agenda, but that possibly could be the agenda.
I'm thinking about failed democracies now. I'm thinking about the likes of the Arab Spring 2011. We saw great change sweep through that part of the world with dictatorships, hardline leaders swept away, but then all of a sudden it goes back to almost like the same thing, or something that looks and feels exactly like the same thing, or chaos in the case of Libya, for instance. Then you think of Afghanistan recently, with the sweeping aside of what was said to be the sort of the building blocks towards democracy, now swept aside by the Taliban regime, with the Taliban claiming power in August. Democracy is a fragile thing. Are you saying, Jean-Francois, that this summit should be about trying to show countries the way, but if you can't actually construct it within the countries, what do you do? I'm leading to a depressing conclusion here, I think, but tell us what you think.
No, I think a summit should be a summit for democracies should be, before anything else, a debate. Isn't democracy a debate by itself? This is the debate here. And I think democracy should be about debating. And yes, indeed, you have to debate about your failures, you have to debate about your successes, and you have to exchange about what can improve democracy once again. Electoral system, dialogue between countries, and once again, the main principles organizing the world. That's what should be the agenda.
I fully agree with
go ahead, Clement.
Michael Lee, is the fact that it's changed as if it's, the point is not to give good points or bad points. The point is, if, and it is the case, democracy is globally endangered, weaker than a few years ago, then those who pretend to support democracy and to be democratic regime must do all they can to strengthen their own regime, their own transparency with the media. And this is something which is terrible in the US. Openness to access to vote, and this is terrible in the US. As always, still transparency of funding of politicians, and it's terrible in the US. These elements, if the US doesn't work on strengthening its own functioning, it would have no legitimacy to blame the others. So let's show that we can strengthen globally the democracy worldwide by threatening the one which pretend to be democratic, and then we will be able to, and I will conclude on that, indeed lead to a democratic management of the global system. Because what is strange with the US is how they pretend to be democratic and how in the past years they didn't take the decisions in a democratic way, not respecting most of the UN resolutions. For example, if we think about the Iraq War.
Okay. Clement, thank you very much indeed. Anybody in the US want to reply to that one? Michael, Sherry.
Well, may I just make a point?
Please.
I think the issue of the invites to the summit has taken outsized and probably unfortunate focus. I mean, look, there's no question that there is some incongruities, shall we say, in the invite
Freedom
list.
House has listed some of those countries, Michael, hasn't it? I mean, obviously you know that. Yeah.
Right. So my point is, I think we have to remember the purpose of the summit. First of all, it's not just these 2 days of virtual meeting. The administration has indicated that it wants to have what they're terming a year of action, in which countries work together to try to advance policies with respect to fighting corruption, supporting independent journalists, supporting human rights defenders. There's a lot of work to be done. They're planning another summit a year from now. I think we have to remind ourselves that we don't really know the outcome, whether this was effective or not, for another couple of years. This could just be a lot of rhetoric and nothing changes. But perhaps a number of initiatives might come out of this that would address some of the problems that are taking place around the world that we've been discussing on your show. So I think, and even the countries that are being criticized, whether it's India or Turkey, they could also improve. They could find it in themselves to change course. Perhaps India might think differently by talking to some of the other people at this conference. I'm not holding my breath, but I think the point is that it's going to take some time for us to know the real impact of this. And we should not just focus on the invite list.
Indeed. It is good to talk, Michael, and you're obviously sort of enlightening us with your thoughts as well. Thank you, sir, very much indeed. Sherry, can I bring you back in? What would your hope be, Sherry Berman there in New York, professor of political science at Barnard? What would your hope be to come from this 2-day summit on democracy? What would you hope to see the kind of lasting effect of it be?
Well, I think that the Biden administration has been wise in phrasing the goals of the Democracy Summit as strengthening and renewing democracy. And so to get to some of my colleagues' earlier points, there is a desire to sort of both recognize the problems that democracy faces in the United States and elsewhere, and to try actively to come up with solutions to those. My colleague at Freedom House, Michael Abramowitz, just mentioned in particular one, which is corruption, which is obviously a widespread problem in many democratic systems. So I think the logic of this is correct, right? Democracy faces challenges. We should come together as democracies to try to devise solutions to strengthen and renew it. I think that is really the way to go forward. I will say also, though, in response to some of the earlier points, that it is undoubtedly true that the United States, for better or worse, as the world's most powerful democracy, could do nothing better to strengthen democracy globally than to address some of its own challenges. Those are real, those are deep, and I think Biden recognizes them and indeed put forward as part of the rationale for this summit, dealing with our country's problems as well as those of democracies globally. So I think that, look, these kinds of things, whether they're going to work or not, very hard to say. But the idea of bringing democracies together, even ones as Michael Abramowitz have said, of questionable democratic, sort of legitimacy, I think that is really at this point the best that can be done. And we can hope that there is follow-up, there are concrete plans made, and there is some ability to keep a coalition together that is directed at dealing with the challenges that democracies face today.
Sherry, thank you very much indeed. Sherry Berman from Barnard College there in New York. Thanks to Michael Abramovitz from Freedom House, president of that organization. Thanks to Clement Perrault here in the studio of the Popular Primary. And thanks to Jean-François Demelio, president of the Asia Centre think tank. Thanks to you all. Thanks to you all for watching. We'll leave you then with the words of Lincoln. All those years ago, 1863, government of the people, by the people, for the people. That definition of democracy may be something we should all cling to. Stay with us here, live from Paris.